It's my absolute pleasure to welcome you all today to this exciting lecture hosted by the Swedish Society for Neuropsychoanalysis. My name is Peter Jakobsson, and I have the honor of serving as the chairman of this association. And with that, let's get started. John, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Peter. And really, a really huge thank you to you, Peter, for inviting me, and to the Swedish Neuropsychoanalysis Association for hosting this, and especially hosting this for a 2 hour event. I'm very appreciative to have this much time to kind of speak and lay out these ideas in this way. I think it's really nice to have that time. Um, so, and let me begin sharing my screen. Okay, and the sound is also being shared. Is that right? Okay, excellent. Um, so as Peter said, I'm going to be speaking about some things in Lacanian neuropsychoanalysis. And so my background is in specifically linking Lacanian psychoanalysis to neuroscience and to the sort of non-Lacanian neuropsychoanalytic work of Mark Solms. And what I'm going to do today, as was advertised in the flyer, there's more or less three parts. The first two are aimed to kind of give a background, since I know folks are coming in from different perspectives, just so that the connections between the Lacanian theory, specifically the register theory, so real, imaginary, and symbolic, so that that's laid out in relation to the neuroscience, especially the work of Jaak Panksepp and the basic emotion theory, which is very central in contemporary neuropsychoanalysis. And then after those two sections, there might maybe like questions or things relating to that. And then I will present some recent work that I'm doing with the idea that comes from this bridge of Lacanian psychoanalysis and neuroscience, that emotions or basic emotional systems are structured like a language, in the sense that Lacan speaks of this. So I'll begin to kind of develop that idea over the course of this lecture. So, but before we get into that, while we're speaking of language and stuff, I apologize if you heard this joke before, but it's a wonderful joke shared by Slavoj Žižek, about the chicken. So, in the joke, a man or a patient, what have you, comes in to see a psychiatrist, or in a hospital, and he comes in and he has this delusional belief that he is a grain of seed, and he's terrified of chickens. He's absolutely terrified of them. And he comes in and he's saying, Doctor, I'm terrified that these chickens are going to eat me, because he believes he's a grain of seed. And so, he goes into a very long analytic treatment. They analyze the delusion, they analyze his childhood and everything. And then they ultimately come to the conclusion, and they shift his belief. He no longer believes he is a grain of seed. He no longer shares or holds on to this belief, and so he's discharged from the hospital, goes out the door. And then a couple minutes later, he comes rushing back in, and he's in a cold sweat, and he says he's hyperventilating this phobia, and the doctor says to him, "Well, what happened? What's wrong?" And the patient says, "I just saw a chicken." And the doctor says, but we've done all this work. You know that you're not a grain of seed. Why are you afraid of the chicken still? And the patient says, well, yes, I know that I'm not a grain of seed, but does the chicken know that? So the idea of the joke is that it's what is mutative in an analysis or in a psychodynamic treatment, it's not only what the patient believes or what, say, the ego believes, the sense of self, the reflective sense of self. It's what Lacan calls the big other believes. It's what the it's not what I as a personal agent believe, but it's what, say, is believed in the unconscious. The big other as the system of symbolic beliefs or history idea. It's the beliefs there that matter, and we even kind of hear this today with contemporary stuff. The things with Neuralink are truly both exciting and quite terrifying. I don't know if folks know about Elon Musk's Neuralink with the implanting chips into the brain. And well, yes, we can. There is technology to control robotic things purely from decoding brain signals. It's very fascinating and scary. But you can imagine something similar today with okay, yes, I know that I shouldn't feel depressed about this, but my brain is depressed. But my there's I know I've done all this work in therapy, but there's still something chemically wrong with my brain, and it's a chemical problem. This sort of language that separates something out, that is the sort of locus of pathology or locus of emotional suffering or what have you. We can imagine someone today saying, yes, well, I know that I should feel perfectly fine, or I know that I shouldn't feel guilty about this. Nevertheless, my brain feels guilty about this. And that sort of subjective division is what Lacan is trying to get at with the idea of both the language as the unconscious. So, if folks can please mute themselves. So the essence of this project of a Lacanian neuropsychoanalysis is to situate this otherness within the brain itself. And this line from I like Pink Floyd, and there's someone in my head and it's not me. This otherness within the brain itself. And how can we think about this otherness in terms of brain structural and functional dynamics? So many of the arguments that I'm going to be talking about in terms of background are elaborated in more detail in the book that Peter mentioned. It's just recently been published by Palgrave. So things are elaborated and more than, and all the references are kind of in there. So I've just left things clean for the presentation. So to begin, let's go into the sort of foundations of Lacanian metapsychology and how this is articulated in relation to the brain. I begin with an example from the wonderful autobiography of her analysis, by Marie Cardinal, The Words to Say It. It's really a wonderful book. And it begins, she has a long history of unexplained vaginal bleeding. And she goes through all sorts of medical treatments of the time, and she's never quite cured. And eventually, after many, many years of going between doctors and hospitals and things, she comes to see a psychoanalyst. And in one of the very early sessions, maybe like the second or the third session, maybe the fourth, she says, as she's talking through her history and everything, she says to the analyst, Doctor, I am bled dry." In terms of her fatigue in speaking about this. And then the doctor says, those are psychosomatic symptoms. Talk about something else. And she feels this like, quote unquote, a slap in the face. Because, this is one of her key symptoms. All of her suffering is wrapped up around this. And she takes it as an insult. Like, how is this person, dismissing this? Talk about something else. This is why I'm coming in. Somehow, and very almost magically, it's one of those kinds of stories, the bleeding stops after this intervention. I don't want to speculate on why exactly it stops, other than it has probably something to do with this intervention and this sort of starting gambit of the treatment. But as one reads the autobiography, the term blood, bleeding, it appears throughout the history. It appears throughout her personal history, the family history. And this illustrates one of the Lacanian sort of approaches to thinking the subject and thinking clinically as well. So for Lacan, there are sort of three registers or domains, dimensions, aspects of human experience, of psychical structure. One is what he calls the imaginary, and it's rooted in for Lacan images, and the idea is that it's sort of the manifest level. It's the what appears, and it's also sort of the area of understanding, where you have sort of an image. It has a certain unity to it. There's a gestalt to it. There's a totality. And in terms of language, this is the area where there is some understanding. There's a fixed meaning. Just like an image is kind of a fixed image, there's also a fixed meaning that is enabled in this imaginary dimension of speaking. In contrast, what Lacan calls the symbolic, he also calls it the big other, or the big other is the locus of signifiers. The symbolic, it's a network of representatives or of representations that's organized in a certain way, but it's sort of the undergirding network that determines the manifest content of the imaginary. And the symbolic is constituted by signifiers. And Lacan, the easiest example is a word, but also phonemes. A signifier is a purely differential representative. And the difference, or what's particular about a signifier, is that a signifier has no inherent referent. So I say the signifier cup. The signifier cup, it's as a purely formal word, is only differentiated by its not being another word. Cup is not the same as pen, is not the same as table. There's this oppositional quality to it. And cup can have multiple reference, multiple images or concepts that are associated with the signifier that depend on the relationship between signifiers. So if I say cup and I say, I am drinking from a cup, that generates an image like this. If you can see my little video box, it's an actual cup. I am drinking from a cup. That sentence, that series of words generates a certain meaning due to the relationship between those words. Versus the verb to cup something denotes something different, denotes a certain action. Versus if you put the term CUP next to ID, Cupid, that's suddenly a different reference that is generated. So the word or the formal dimension finds a reference based on its relationship with other representatives. There is no inherent relationship between the word cup and the image cup. That has to be learned, that has to be linked together. And that comes from the interaction between the imaginary and the symbolic. Let me just adjust my pointer so that jumps out. Okay, so the connection between a signifier and what Lacan calls a signified comes from the overlap between imaginary and symbolic. And the idea being that, well, one signifier can have multiple meanings, some of which may not be necessarily manifest. The third dimension is what Lacan calls the real. And the real, it's defined almost negatively. It is what resists symbolization, absolutely. It's what resists being captured in any kind of representation, whether that's the image or whether that's in language. It is what is unnameable, what insists as not being spoken. And Lacan links it to the drive. It is the dimension of excitation. It is the dimension of libido, the dimension of death drive. It's the dimension of the drive, that sort of pressure, that push, that by itself has no mental or imagistic or declarative representation. That has to be linked to the drive. For example, the hungry child does not have the words innately linked to the feeling associated with hunger. I am hungry. No, the child feels that. The child lets out a cry, And the mother has to interpret, oh, you are hungry, or oh, you are cold, or oh, you are, wanting comfort. Yeah, so that unnameable impulse has to find some kind of representative, and that is indexed to particular history, to particular interactions. So just to continue here, for example, in the words to say it, we can think about that opening example of bleeding like this. There is some inarticulable element of the body, some affective suffering, let's say, in relation to the body, in relation to interpersonal relationships. That real element finds some representative based on one's past experiences. And in this case, it finds the representative in the signifier blood, in the role that blood had in the individual history of Marie Cardinal, in the family history. And then it finds a manifest representation, an imaginary representation, or an imaginary element of it, in the symptom of the bleeding. And with this comes fixed identifications and appearances. So prior to this point, Marie Cardinal, her entire life was organized around this symptom. It was organized around the bleeding that gave her a sort of an identity, an appearance as a patient, an identity as a patient who has this symptom of unexplained bleeding. There's this fixity to it. And what the intervention does, talk about something else. It loosens this. It loosens this manifest meaning, hinging on this signifier blood. It gives a different meaning to it. Let me give another example. Let me just exit out from here to read it. This is an example from Ariane Bazin, a wonderful clinician and researcher in France. This is from a recent publication of her work with a patient. I'll just read it. When Paul knocks on my door that night for his session, he is all sweaty and short-breathed. He lays down on the couch and tells me he has taken an unusual route to come to me today. While walking to my cabinet, he suddenly decided to make a detour through the park, even if this would delay him, and even if the darkness that was already falling was not reassuring. No problem, he says to himself, I will run for once, he thought, and that's what he did. However, once deep into the trees, he had the impression that a man was following him, and so he set up running harder, which caused him to stumble over a tree root. Back on his feet, he quote unquote ran for his life and arrived at her doorstep. She says, I considered that Paul was setting a stage for some message he could not put into words, or which I failed to hear. His sweaty appearance and the possibly violent erotic undertone of his adventure suggested that the message was indeed probably erotic violent in nature. While freely associating, Paul spoke about the trees and the woods. When he was a child and a youth, he adored to spend hours in a nearby wood. He squatted a hut, and it was even there that he had his first sexual experience. All of this had a sad, not a conflictual undertone. Then he mentioned that Into the Woods had long been one of his favorite musicals. And so it was for my brother, he added. Funny, he says, now that I think about it, my street is called Forest Avenue. And then Bazin says, bingo, now I heard it. Forest, I repeated, Forest. Forest was the name of Paul's brother, almost 15 years his elder. Forest with 2 R's. Forrest came back to live with his parents and hence with Paul after his divorce at 21. He was utterly depressed, and the only thing which gave him entertainment was Paul, who then looked up at this elder, accomplished brother, who gave him the attention he missed from his parents. But there was also a darker side to this attention, which only now came to the fore. Forrest was also vaguely threatening, as an intrusive presence. Paul now recalls his intrusive glances and his way of looking through the crack of the bedroom door. Hence, Paul was indeed chased by Forrest after all, but it took a signifier staging for him to express it, and for her to read it, she has to read it, she writes as a rebus, or more specifically as a signifier. So here we can see these elements again. There's some real bodily elements in the sweatiness, the running. There's some affective intensity. He's kind of in a panic. There is the manifest experience, the imaginary experience. Okay, yeah, I wanted to walk to a session today, but I'm running late, so I'm going to run through the park. And then, there's this manifest experience, the symptom of fearing being followed by someone. That's the explicit meaning attributed, right? But then listening not only to that explicit meaning, but also, and more importantly, to the words used to convey that: trees, woods, into the woods, forest street, forest, the name of the brother. It is through the signifiers that the hidden message is revealed. It's through just get my pointer back here. It's through this link, the equivocity of forest street, forest, the name of the brother, that the meaning of the symptom becomes manifest or is translated. And this is Lacan's idea that the unconscious is structured like a language, that there is this sort of differential play, and you have to listen for the repetition of certain elements, especially words, not in their meaning, but in their sort of formal logic, in how they sound, essentially. So to take a step back and think about, this is not only how Lacan approaches the clinic, this is also how Lacan approaches let's say, metapsychology. There is the conscious imaginary experience. So here in this example, this little baby looks at its image in the mirror and, that is me. I recognize myself. And this is, Lacan talks about the mirror stage here. This imaginary dimension, it's, as I've said, that domain of unity, understanding, wholeness, meaning. But importantly for Lacan, the manifest, the level of imaginary totality is oriented by the symbolic. So, for example, the mother might say, "Oh, what a pretty child you are," or "Oh, your name is John," or someone else might, or you might say, "Oh, you have your grandmother's eyes." Those words, who, especially for the little child, have no meaning whatsoever. Nevertheless, those words, those sounds get linked to this image and create a certain enigma that nevertheless has this relationship to it. So how one sees oneself, how one experiences and makes sense of oneself is oriented by the unconscious, not as some deeper meaning, but as this sort of play of important signifiers that are laid down in the subject's history. You have eyes like your grandmother might open up an avenue to identify with this grandmother. It might determine that as an element in the history. Perhaps there's the sharing of a name. Often people are named after family members or bear the middle name of another family member. These create potential opportunities for connections, not at the level of meaning, but at the level of words. And so the symbolic, as language, and more generally also as sort of social structures, social relationships that are unconscious, but they permeate speech. And this is the unconscious dimension of coordinates in Freudian terms. This is the sort of the latent ideas of the dream. So in the dream, there's the manifest content and the latent content. The manifest content is the dream as dreamt, the images associated with the dream. The latent content is the ideas that went into the formation of those images. So, for example, let's say that Bazin's patient dreamed of running through a forest. You have the image forest, but the unconscious latent idea is the brother, and it finds its connection to the dream through the signifier forest. And so you have to read the image through the linguistic dimension. And lastly, the element of the real, as I've been saying, it's that element of the drive. It's that element that is not represented, but nevertheless impacts and warps psychical experience. These signifiers and images are organized around the drive. The child finds unity in the mirror when there may be chaotic, multiple discomforting experiences in the body. There's some anxiety that finds a representative through the signifier and the image forest. Often it's kind of used as a metaphor of a black hole, where you can't quite, it distorts the space around it, and there is no sort of light or a representation of the black hole itself. It's sort of a negative space, a void, that nevertheless structures things. And this is the dimension of the unconscious as a pure gap. The unconscious not as determined by words, but the unconscious as that sort of pressure of the drive, that pressure of the drive around which words and images circulate without ever fully managing, but nevertheless shaping how the drive takes shape for a particular subject. Lacan uses the term jouissance. It's a French term. It can be translated as enjoyment, but it's more properly an excess of excitation that may be experienced positively, maybe negatively, more likely a mix. It's a pleasure it's too pleasurable that it becomes traumatic. It's sort of that excess excitation of the drive beyond homeostasis, very importantly. It's beyond the logic of sort of homeostatic regulation. The drive, jouissance, it's that surplus. In the example, you can think about anorexia as an example here, where the drive element here, the excess of hunger or lack thereof, or the reverse direction, just negate the excess, splits off from the homeostatic element of hunger satisfaction, where in pure homeostasis, I have a certain blood glucose level set point, or a certain destination of the stomach. When that deviates from where I expect it to be, I feel hungry. Then I eat, and then after enough time, then my blood glucose returns to its level, or my stomach feels full, and at which point I am no longer hungry. That is purely within the logic of homeostasis. Eating disorders are examples of the drive pushing beyond that homeostatic logic into some kind of excess, either in the negative direction in anorexia or in the surplus direction in bulimia. Okay, so with these ideas, I just want to review some sort of common ideas in current neuropsychoanalysis, and then how specifically we can think about a Lacanian approach to doing this. There are two common views, and so this first view, what I'm calling a convergent view, this is the view held by many people, myself included to a degree, and also in neuropsychoanalysis, that neuroscience can provide convergent or divergent evidence for psychoanalytic concepts. This is sort of, and people might rejoice, and we do that. Hey, look, a lot of contemporary brain research supports Freudian theories and stuff. That's sort of a convergent, or provides evidence against it. There are some folks, many folks, who are critical of neuropsychoanalysis, both Lacanian and not Lacanian, who will say something ultimately to the effect that psychoanalysis operates at a different register or a different domain from neuroscience. Some people will argue that meaning making is unique to psychoanalysis. There's no meaning making in neuroscience, therefore these are separate. Some Lacanians will say that no, what's important is the real of the clinic, not the unknowability elsewhere, and therefore psychoanalysis is separate, or that what matters is language, how people speak, not brain activity. The brain doesn't speak. There's no language in the brain. So these sorts of things, ultimately, which are saying that there's a transcendental domain or register that is beyond concrete embodiment, i.e. beyond the brain, and therefore the brain is irrelevant. So these are the two most common positions. And here, in a Lacanian neuropsychoanalytic viewpoint that I take, I follow this instead thread from Slavoj Žižek, which is to say that the issue of today's advances in brain sciences is not to choose either of these, whether is it support or not, or to be sort of completely separating and say that, oh no, psychoanalysis is just of a different dimension. Instead, and this is what I think is fascinating in contemporary work, especially with affects, is that the goal is to meet the real of neuroscience with another real. And I sort of translate this as to meet some antagonism some incongruity, something that does not quite work, something that pushes beyond, something that uh, 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 is cause for dehiscence between action and representation, between drive and how it's satisfied, that difference has to be found within the brain itself. And that antagonism, that real, that unnameable element, is the turning point where that opens onto the real of psychoanalysis. In other words, to find a place for psychoanalysis within the inherent impossibilities that are articulated within neuroscience. Not to say that neuroscience is irrelevant, but within neuroscience, that there are own antagonisms and incongruences within the brain. That is where you find a place for psychoanalysis within neuroscience. And to sort of, I'll skip that diagram because I don't think it's that helpful. And what we're saying is, and in a certain sense, it's kind of epistemologically not very as ambitious as some people maybe make it out to be. By describing brain correlates, I have not explained anything. Within this view of neuropsychoanalysis, making a connection between, say, a Lacanian concept and a neuroscientific concept has not explained the Lacanian concept. It merely draws a correlation. Okay, this is what we see and what we describe when we look at things from a psychoanalytic perspective. This is how we see it when we look at it from a neuroscience perspective, looking at the brain as an object. This is not endeavoring to explain away psychoanalysis by reference to neuroscience or vice versa. It's to put them into dialogue. No one field has epistemological or ontological priority over the other. And what is particular in a Lacanian neuropsychoanalysis is that in this view, the brain is, to use this Lacanian term, not all. Because there is some real, because there is some, from a Lacanian viewpoint, some element that disrupts, some element that disrupts meaning, some element that disrupts full capture by representation. In Marie Cardinal's case, there's this some element of the drive that is managed in some way by language and by her social experiences and her meaning making, but it's never eliminated. It's still there. And I'll develop this idea in some more detail as we go through the lecture. But that's some disharmony, that there's always some element of the mind that is not fully mirrored within itself, something that is beyond one's own understanding. The ego is not master in its own house. There is always some kernel of the unconscious that is never made conscious. There's always some necessary division. This same idea, this non-totality, must also be identifiable within the brain as well. And that is some what I'll discuss, and from that leading to the idea that affects operate like signifiers. And this view of the brain it's a view of the brain as not perfectly governed by homeostasis. To be clear, there's this joke of in the beginning, God was creating the earth, created all the animals and everything, and then last God creates man, and then he shows the archangel, Gabriel, Michael, whatever, hey, look, Gabriel, I made man. Then Gabriel looks at God and like, God, what did you do? This is terrible. It's a monkey with anxiety. The brain is full of errors and misfirings and short circuits. The brain is constantly sort of barely functioning. It's barely functioning optimally. There's all sorts of opportunities for misfirings, for things not going well, that are not errors to be corrected. Those errors are in fact constitutive and fundamental to subjective experience. And I'll develop some of this in the following section. Okay, actually, I am magically somehow on time. Okay, so let's just keep going right into part two. So now I will discuss some of the connections and the most essential connections for talking about affects like signifiers by linking neuropsychoanalytic work by Mark Solms and who draws heavily on Jaak Panksepp with these Lacanian ideas that I just discussed. And then after this, maybe we can have a little discussion, at least on questions around this general integration before I talk about affects like signifiers. So importantly, I want to go through each of Panksepp's basic emotional systems. Maybe this is familiar to some folks, but maybe not. And so hopefully this will not be too repetitive. But Jaak Panksepp was a very influential and highly brilliant neuroscientist who studied the basic emotional systems of the brain using primarily deep brain stimulation methods and pharmacological methods. So deep brain stimulation, inserting electrodes into mammal brains, animal brains, and stimulating different parts to essentially see what happens. And he carved out 7 basic emotional circuits, and there's some debate, are there maybe more than 7, less, but the idea is that there's more than one, and that they're differentiated. So the different emotional circuits that are common across all mammals, not just humans. And very importantly, they are all present at birth. They are part of our genetic evolutionary inheritance. And I'll go through each one and sort of discuss them because they will be relevant for how we develop the argument of affects as linguistic. So first, and I believe the first to have evolved is what Jaak calls the seeking system. It's also called the mesolimbic mesocortical dopamine system. In the addictions literature, this is called the wanting system or the reward system, the reward seeking system. And the essential idea is its excitation of the system produces positive, enthusiastic engagement with the world in general. Jaak called it a goad without a goal. It's this sort of excitation of something good is out there. You don't quite know what it is. There isn't sort of a preordained object, but it's just proactively engaging with novelty, with uncertainty. So if you think about if you've ever seen a dog or taken a dog to like a new place or like a new field, what does the dog do? The dog runs around, right? The dog runs around, sniffs over there, what's over here, what's over there, and explores, to a new house, runs around, or hopefully if they're not scared, explores all these different things. It's not necessarily looking for something in particular, it's exploring. This is what's also called behavioral foraging. In humans, not only behavioral foraging, but Carl Friston discusses epistemic foraging. So hopefully I'm speaking about something new here, and there's sort of, for everyone, there's hopefully a positive, proactive engagement with this novelty. A positive, hopefully excitatory engagement with uncertainty. Huh? And the opposite of this, when the system is understimulated, it gives the clinical picture, at least, of a depressive presentation, where there's a non-engagement with the world in general, a non-energization, a loss of motivation. Patients with lesions in this circuit have adynamia, avolition. There's a lack of motivation. And in excess excitation of the system, you can produce psychotic-like symptoms. You can produce mania. If you've ever taken cocaine or methamphetamines or other stimulants, those act very directly on this system. It's a very sort of positive excitation of, okay, yes, something is out there. You might talk very quickly. Think very quickly, the sort of rapidity of stuff. That's from activity in this system. With certain of those both emotional and behavioral correlates. And importantly, a certain positive kind of affect, enthusiastic engagement, and a certain kind of negative affect on the other end of it, kind of a depressive presentation. Okay, one of the next system I'll talk about is rage. And this system, it essentially comes from what we have been given by evolution, that we want to remove obstacles to our goals. So if you have a certain goal state or something you want, and something gets in the way, how do you feel? You feel angry. You feel frustrated. You feel irritated. And rage, activation of this system, it's to attack. It's to destroy whatever is getting in your way, whatever is causing frustration. And this circuit has a distinct neuroanatomy, distinct pharmacology cascade from seeking. All of these are differentiable. And within rage, there's a certain, again, different kind of positive negative valence dimension. The frustration of rage feels bad in a certain way. You feel angry, you feel irritated, you're, furious. And then there's a certain particular kind of relief, satisfaction by, letting them have it, really attacking them, destroying whatever is in the way. To give an example, I think the sound should share. And this is one of those creepy brain things of how you can stimulate.
A clearer experiment was performed with cats. In this classic example, the hypothalamus, the rhythm maker, was implanted with electrodes. Could it be responsible not just for rhythms, but also for rage? The switch is turned. Then the switch is turned off. So indeed, the hypothalamus does control certain types of aggression. Yet, when another region of the hypothalamus is stimulated, we see another kind of aggression. The quiet biting attack, the silent stalk after a rat, and the calculated kill. Turn off the switch, and the kill is forgotten.
So it's not as straightforward in humans, but it's not as straightforward either. There are cases, example of stimulating certain deep brain regions, such as the substantia nigra, and inducing a severe depressive state in a patient that has no history of depression. And then when removing that stimulation, within 30 seconds, the depressive affect goes away. When it's stimulated, it become incredibly suicidal with no history of suicidality. So the idea here that all of these systems have a particular circuitry, and you can see with the rage in particular, what's the behavioral correlate there? There's a certain, frustration, but what does the cat do? Bares its claws, hisses, scratching, attacking. And it's kind of this hot aggression, this attack, in contrast to a different kind of attack that has to do with hunting, rather than frustration or anger. Okay, let's continue. The next one is lust. And this is sort of what we think about as, I like the phrase Solms uses, veterinary sexuality. So sexuality in the genital sense, in terms of genital sexual engagement. The idea here is, evolutionarily speaking, it is good to reproduce. And this is why we've inherited this system, that it creates a certain kind of excitation, a certain kind of frustration, sexual frustration, when it's not satisfied, and then a certain kind of pleasure, orgasmic pleasure, when there is this satisfaction. And in this pleasure, to be clear, it's a distinct kind of pleasure from seeking, say. Seeking, the pleasure is associated with this engagement, with this enthusiastic increase of excitation, this increase of uncertainty and novelty, versus the pleasure of lust is a consumatory pleasure. It's a satiety kind of pleasure. It's this decrease of tension. Fear is another one. And the idea here is that it is good to stay safe from bodily harm. So someone comes at you with a knife, you feel a certain way, and you feel bad, a certain kind of negative affect that is different from someone who is frustrating you. Frustration, you feel negatively in one way. Fear, there's a different kind of response. And then the behavioral correlate here is the freeze or flee response. You freeze, or in more intense activation, you flee. And in the evolutionary jungle, it's good to flee from predators, flee from. And if you remember in the video with the cat, so this one was doing the clawing and biting. This one, what was this one doing? This one was, kind of scuttling away. That's the fear response. When something's coming at you and attacking you, one response is to get away from it, and that's motivated by a certain affect, and that's controlled by the fear circuit. Both the rage and fear have key sort of overlaps and cornerstones in the amygdala. Different parts of the amygdala, but in the amygdala nonetheless. Another very important, well, they're all very important, but another one is panic or panic grief. And this is one end of the attachment bonding system. For panic grief, the idea is that it is good to stay close to your caregivers. It is good to stay close and form attachments with others. And it feels bad to be separated from attachment figures. What happens when you see a child separated from its parent in a novel place? It cries. There's a certain kind of distress vocalization, separation distress, that anxiety of losing an attachment figure. And there's a certain behavioral response that goes with it, crying out, screaming out, calling out, seeking out the lost caregiver. A certain kind of anxiety, separation anxiety, that is different from the anxiety associated with fear. Fear is an anxiety around threats to the body, threat to the ego, threat to me, versus this is about loss. And when panic is active for long enough, it transitions into grief. And so in the first kind of phase of panic activation, you get an increase of excitation, seeking, properly speaking, seeking out the lost caregiver. It activates seeking, but looking for the attachment object. But when that goes on for too long, eventually, in the research, and unless there's other things going on, it transitions into sort of a depressive shutdown. And the idea that's developed from the evolutionary perspective is that, okay, if you think about the evolutionary jungle, there's the little baby, mammal gets separated from its mother. The little baby mammal cries out because hopefully mommy will come back to protect me. However, if you are a predator and you hear a little tiny mammal doing these separation distress vocalizations, that tells you, oh, there's a little helpless mammal around whose parent is not with it. They are easy prey. So the idea, the hypothesis is that the depressive grief phase of this evolved to shut down that distress vocalization, because only ever being distressed, one, spends a lot of resources, and two, calls attention to the helplessness. So this is sort of the separation distress circuit, and deals with loss. The other end of the attachment is the caregiver side, care, and this is Jaak Panksepp. Care is sort of, it is good to take care of and nurture others, and this feels positive in a certain way. The positive experience of being the attachment figure, of being able to soothe, versus frustrations to care feel negatively in their own way. When the mother is trying to comfort the child and the child keeps crying, that's a certain kind of frustration that is, it's different from the frustration of separation distress, or different from fear anxiety. There's a certain I'm unable to achieve to deal with this care impulse. Likewise, the positive negative end here is different as well. Panic grief, the negative, it feels bad in terms of separation distress, and reunion with an attachment figure feels good in a different way than destroying an object of frustration feels good, than engaging in a happy open field or a simulating talk feels. And the last one is play. The idea here with the play system is it is good to form sort of reciprocal social engagements and social interactions. And in the animal studies, the behavioral correlate here is rough and tumble play. So if you have pets, especially dogs, it's very easy to see this, or rats too, or hamsters. If you get two dogs together and they play, what do? One kind of, bends down, sticks his butt up in the air, he looks up, maybe barks in a certain way. One chases the other for a bit, and then they reverse, and that one chases the other one back, and they kind of run back and forth, and there's lots of running. It's the zoomies kind of a thing. So they're playing. It's this give and take, this back and forth. You can see this in humans in the game of tag. It's the perfect example. One person chases the other, or chases a group of people, then whoever is caught becomes it, and then they do the chasing. So again, there's this reciprocality and this back and forth. What is one way for someone to not play with other people? Someone who always wins, someone who doesn't do that back and forth. It no longer is fun when you're playing a game and someone always wins. There has to be a certain balance. And there's in the research, there's a 60-40 rule that things have to stay within that 60-40 range of winning and losing. Once it goes out of that, the game is no longer fun. And again, to reiterate, play feels good in a certain way. It feels good in terms of the social interaction that is different from the feeling good of reunion with an attachment figure, feels different from the feeling good of escaping from threat, that sort of calm that comes over. And likewise, the negative pole feels different in its own way in terms of the feeling of social exclusion or the feeling of no one playing with you and not having that kind of reciprocality. So, okay, those are the basic emotional systems. And again, they're common across all mammals. And very importantly, they are conscious. And this comes from, in part from Freud's argument, but also Solms' synthesis of considerable neuroscientific evidence. The brain circuits that are associated with these systems, especially, the periaqueductal gray, PAG. It's an upper brainstem structure, which is the terminal point for all of these circuits. And stimulation of the different columns of the periaqueductal gray generate either intense pleasure or intense unpleasure. Though that region in particular is very important for consciousness. Lesions to periaqueductal gray can cause coma, versus lesions elsewhere in the brain, especially in the neocortex, do not cause coma most of the time. And as I've been saying it, they're affectively conscious. In other words, you feel a certain way and, well, you have that feeling. That feeling is conscious. Versus in the clinical example I gave before, you can have unconscious ideas, but Freud says in the 1915 unconscious essay, it is impossible for affects to be unconscious in the way that ideas are. The essence of a feeling is to feel it. It's kind of an oxymoron to think of an unconscious affect. What is a feeling that's not felt? And if it's felt, it's conscious affectively. Importantly, it's conscious, it's felt without necessarily having a representation. And this is the key. You can have, and this is one of the things people come to therapy for. You have a feeling, but you may not know why you have that feeling. I feel anxious. I may attach it to some things, but it kind of exceeds, what I'm manifestly anxious about. I feel anxious about something, but I don't know what. Or I feel separation distress. All signs say that the relationship is going well. Nevertheless, I have the separation anxiety. Or I feel a certain phobia or a sort of generalized anxiety. It doesn't sort of land on anything. That these affects can be conscious without having a representation. As I've been saying, and as I discussed as I went through each of them, each has a particular quality of pleasure and unpleasure. So where Freud talks about the pleasure principle, where there's this sort of continuous dimension of a pleasure-unpleasure series where things feel more or less good or bad, positive or negative, pleasurable and unpleasurable. In a sense, each of these circuits has its own pleasure principle. Each has its own quality of pleasure and quality of unpleasure. This will be very important later on. As it's discussed and as it was researched, these emotions operate homeostatically, in addition to other homeostatic drives such as hunger, thirst, urination needs, and so on. But they operate homeostatically in order to motivate behavior and mental or cognitive work. In other words, as I've been saying, each of them has what's called a set point, a homeostatic set point. It is good to blank. You're not conscious of that idea, but that's sort of what motivates or organizes the system. For seeking, it is good to engage with novelty and uncertainty. Or for attachment, it is good to stay close to caregivers. Deviations from that set point, not engaging with uncertainty or separation from the caregiver, that's a deviation from the homeostatic set point. That deviation generates unpleasure, a particular kind of unpleasure, an increase of tension, moving toward the set point, engaging with uncertainty, reuniting with the attachment figure, feels pleasurable in its own kind of way. Moving away from the set point generates unpleasure, moving toward the set point generates pleasure, and the brain is organized and does all this behavioral and cognitive work in order to try to orient and keep within these homeostatic bounds, to move toward the homeostatic set point. In other words, to minimize unpleasure, in other words, to seek pleasure. They all, in this way, operate according to the pleasure principle, which is a homeostatic principle. Pleasure principle is a principle of homeostasis. Okay, that's the sort of overview. And all of the different emotions work this way. They each have their own different sort of kind of homeostasis. Okay, so with this, and here I'm summarizing a lot, but hopefully the overall overarching picture is clear. And we can, if not, then please sort of ask questions when we get to that point in the discussion. But the idea here is that based on this research of these basic emotional circuits, and these arrows here are those different emotional systems. You can see that they're all housed in the upper brainstem here. Their source nuclei are in the upper brainstem, and they project through limbic structures into the neocortex, which is the outer layer of the brain here. This is where all of the fancy cognitive machinery happens: visual spatial cognition, language, executive function, and so on. The idea is that from all of this research and from clinical work with brain injury patients, broadly speaking, one can dynamically localize the ego to the neocortex. All of the functions that Freud associated with the ego, the body image, reality testing, motoricity control, drive management, orientation toward the external world, that is all performed functionally by, not entirely, there's some other structures, but largely by the neocortex, by this outer portion of the brain here. That does the same functions that Freud attributed to the ego. And Freud at some point even speculates that the ego might correspond to the outer part of the brain. And in contrast, the id, the drives, correspond to the upper brainstem and the associated limbic projections, specifically these basic emotional circuits that I just spoke about. That's sort of, those basic emotions can be thought about as the infrastructure of the id. These different drives, Freud posited two categories of drives, libidinal drives and death drives. Solms' recent work argues that we think about the id as consisting of at least these 7 basic emotional drives. Again, and they function as drives, and those correspond to a different broad interacting region of the brain. And these sort of color-coded things just point to that connection. Okay, so now we come to the next part. And this is where the Lacan starts to come in. We have said that the ego, the neocortex, aims to satisfy needs. In other words, aims to satisfy the needs generated and felt by the id. The feeling of unpleasure is the feeling of some need, some homeostatic set point that has not been met. Okay. In other words, the aim of the ego is to eliminate affective consciousness. If you feel conscious because you've deviated from your homeostatic set point, then the aim of the ego is to minimize that consciousness by satisfying the drive. Ego or egoic consciousness, cognitive consciousness, representational consciousness of language, visual spatial cognition, and so on, is roused or activated by id consciousness. It is roused to meet the demands of the id. We are conscious of things because there is some deviation from homeostatic set points that we are then trying to manage. Again, think about, what is the child who has been separated from the caregiver thinking about? Oh, they're thinking about the caregiver. They're looking around, they're exploring everything because that is the drive system that has been prioritized, activated, and is motivating both behavior and attention throughout the entire brain. And the goal is to reunite with the caregiver. In other words, to make the feeling go away. This leads to, in other words, affect, feeling, is a signal for something that the ego has not managed. If you're feeling something, in other words, it's because you haven't dealt with it, essentially. If you feel hungry, it's because you haven't dealt with your hunger. If you feel separation distress, it's because you haven't dealt with your attachment needs. If you feel a sort of depression, then or depressive feeling, then it's because you haven't dealt with the need to engage with novelty. In other words, affect signals something beyond the ego's managerial capacities. What the ego doesn't have to think about, what the ego can be unconscious of, is automatically dealing with things. If the ego can manage something automatically, in other words, unconsciously, then you don't need to feel it. You don't need to be conscious of it. Indeed, you won't be conscious of it, and it will not come to mind. When something is being felt, it signals that there's something beyond the ego, something in excess of the ego, something that is foreign or alien to the ego. And I am arguing that in a Lacanian viewpoint, affective consciousness is, to use this Lacanian neologism, extimate to egoic consciousness. And extimate, it's a word that Lacan invents. It's a condensation of exterior and intimate. And he uses it to describe the unconscious. It's what is most intimate to the subject is simultaneously something that is exterior to the subject. It's an internal exteriority or an interior exteriority. What is most precious is something that is not fully within the remit of the ego, of the I, of the sense of self. That surprising disruption of the drive, that fright of anxiety. In other words, affective consciousness is foreign to egoic consciousness. In other words, and as I've said, sort of summarizing from extensive research, the brain circuits that are associated with affective consciousness are necessary for consciousness. In other words, the id is conscious, and this is Solms' thesis. In other words, the ego is in itself unconscious. It only becomes conscious when activated by the id. As I've said, we know this, we can perform visual spatial perception, language processing without consciousness. Implicit priming is evidence for this. What this leads to, and this I think is wonderfully conciliant with the Lacanian idea of this internal otherness, again, the ego is not master in its own house. The core of consciousness, affective consciousness, is exterior, it's foreign to the ego, to the I, to the sense of self, to the meaning that you make of yourself, your own self-explanation. That is separate from the core of consciousness. The core of consciousness is, in fact, something that is external to the ego. But nevertheless, the ego is dependent on that foreignness for its operation. There is this alien quality to affective consciousness, to the drives as foreign to the ego. So not only in terms of in Freudian terms, Freud has this whole thing of psychoanalysis has delivered the next great narcissistic insult to man by claiming that the ego is not master in its own house, that a large part of the mind is unconscious. Well, in my Lacanian reading of Solms's work, it goes even further. The core of consciousness is not even egoic. For Freud, he attributed consciousness to the ego. No, if the id is conscious, then the ego, the core of your consciousness is not even your sense of self. It is something that is initially foreign to the sense of self that has to be managed or cathected in some way. Okay, so that's sort of Lacanian take on the thesis of the conscious id, that if the id is conscious, it's a consciousness that is foreign initially and residually to egoic consciousness. And to make the connection with the registers, the id is a fount not merely of affective consciousness, the id is a fount of jouissance. The drive as something that is excessive or beyond. The drive is felt precisely because homeostasis has not been achieved. If there is a feeling, it is because homeostasis is not fully operative. And this is where I develop this point. So what is essential is that these basic emotional systems conflict with each other. At the level of one's evolutionary inheritance, there is not a seamless homeostasis. These basic drives, even before we get all the complexity of interpersonal life, they already conflict with each other. For Solms, I won't go into this in detail, but for Solms, This conflict is in fact necessary for consciousness, that these systems have to be qualitatively distinct. And as I've repeated, they're not only continuous variables in the sense of, oh, you feel more or less good, more or less unpleasurable, more or less pleasurable. These different emotional circuits are also categorically distinct. In other words, there are different categories of pleasure and unpleasure. The feeling good of panic, attachment bonding, feels different from the feeling good of play, feels different from the feeling good of care, feels different from the feeling good of seeking, and so on. And likewise for the unpleasure. Because these different emotions are categorically distinct, this is very important, they have to be prioritized, because dealing with one affect leads to different behaviors, actions, cognitions, thoughts than dealing with another affect. So for example, if there is some aversive stimulus, some aversive person or a situation, one person might respond with fearful anxiety. They might freeze, flee, shut down, become inhibited. Another person might get really angry, and they might really kind of, speak out against it and whatnot. In other words, there's some context where it's unsure, it's unpredicted what to do. It's not clear, not fully determined what the ego should do in this situation. In other words, there's a conflict. There's a conflict, at least, between fear and rage. The ego has to choose what to do. And this is a properly subjective choice. This is what I call the prioritization function of affective consciousness. In other words, one system has to be prioritized. One system has to be selected and others not selected. And this is why in the same situation, one person might feel fear and another person might feel rage. They have interpreted the situation by selecting a different affect. And that selection, that prioritization drives the interpretation of the context. It drives the choices that are made. It drives voluntary action. It drives thinking and so on. But again, the prioritization depends on there being categorically distinct domains of feeling in conflictual, uncertain contexts. And it's here that I read the most elementary opening for the real, where Solms makes the point that there is no way that evolution could have provided us with or evolved a meta prediction or a meta set of predictions to a priori automatically say which system to prioritize in which context. It's impossible. The data, one, is impossible to fully encode in the genome, and two, there's no way evolution can predict all of the uncertain things that can happen. Evolution moves very slowly, and our human interpersonal world is, for better or worse, incredibly complicated and incredibly uncertain. It's full. Uncertainty is the rule in our life. There's no way to a priori automatically know what to do in all these different situations. So we can't beforehand know what to do. So in other words, you have to feel it, that there is sort of an impossibility of a perfect automatic resolution that is innate. In other words, you feel the excess and then you have to learn what to do with it. There's no sort of pre-existing harmony among the basic emotional systems. There's a quote from Ariane Bazin. I love it. There is no homeostasis of homeostasis. And it's a Lacanian play a Lacanian aphorism. There is no other of the other. In other words, yes, each system functions homeostatically. Pleasure, unpleasure. You motivated to move toward pleasure, motivated to not like and try to avoid unpleasure. Nevertheless, there is no homeostasis. There's no meta homeostasis of, okay, which of these homeostases do I prioritize? And this is because, say, for example, the most elementary conflict, panic says stay close to caregivers. Seeking says go see what else is out there. Fear says avoid the aversive object. Rage says attack the aversive object, destroy it. Panic says, or panic, care, lust says, oh, love, connect with, have this sort of gratification with the pleasure-giving other. The rage says when this other person is frustrating you, destroy them, attack them, tear them to shreds. These basic emotions, their set points conflict with each other. And there is no perfect resolution. There is no harmony that's possible. And this is why emotional systems and why interpersonal life is rife with conflict, because the emotional needs themselves do not overlap with each other. That's what's different from, say, more basic homeostats like hunger and thirst. Hunger, certain blood glucose level; thirst, certain I don't even know, but certain sort of hydration level in the body versus sodium levels. All these things. Those set points do not conflict with each other. However, these emotional ones do, and there is no getting around that conflict. It's a constitutive conflict. It's a constitutive antagonism within the brain itself. At the level of our evolutionary inheritance, the brain is itself conflictual. And this is where I come back to that argument that this constitutive conflict, this constitutive antagonism between these basic emotions generates necessarily always some residual background of affective consciousness. No matter what you do, no matter what action plans, cognitions, behaviors you lay down, there will always be some residual affect, some residual surplus of felt uncertainty, of felt, okay, I don't know what's wrong, but it's sort of foreign. It's not something that I've managed, but nevertheless, I'm feeling it. It's intruding on me, hence I'm feeling it. That is inevitable. And it arises due to the lack of a meta prediction. And this is the Lacanian idea that there's not only the real of the drive, or the real is not simply the drive, but it's the symbolic itself. The symbolic is it's a purely differential system. It has no clear meaning. It has no clear reference point to the imaginary, to representations, to meanings. That the symbolic itself is thwarted, twisted, antagonistic, and that real names the very sort of twisting and warping of the symbolic. And at that torsional point, at that point of the sort of incommensurability of language to be fully stable, language never lands on a certain meaning. There's always the potential for more meaning, for more uncertainty. It's like, well, yes, you told me this, but do you really mean that? Or you can keep adding words to keep changing the meaning of what you said before. It's limitless. That lack of a stable meaning is the point where uncertainty, jouissance, felt uncertainty arises. And I'm using that same framework, and you can see it here in the idea of these basic emotions. Let's just move on to here. So again, you have these different basic emotional systems at least. This is the demand of the drive. It comes together. They all sort of have to go into the external world. That's what's called confluence with seeking. But more importantly, they conflict with each other. There is no seamless homeostasis of these individual homeostats. Hence, you get this affective consciousness, which again, as I've said, in itself is not representational. It's the purely felt pressure of the drive. It's a pure feeling. Everything you do, all of the cognitive work demanded, all of the representatives, the words that are chosen, the action plans taken, the images generated, all of that work is therefore necessarily a compromise formation. You prioritize one, you lay down an action plan that deals with that. Okay, I'm in this attachment conflict. I'm going to prioritize staying with the attachment figure. Guess what? That leaves rage unsatisfied. And there's a residual of anger, say. I'm simplifying, but this is the idea. Anything that is laid down in memory, whether at a non-declarative level of purely automatic body memories, purely unconscious action plans, or at a declarative level of images, words, language, things we can talk about, it necessarily fails to fully resolve affective consciousness. It fails to fully resolve uncertainty. Hence, we're always conscious. The ego never succeeds in getting rid of affective consciousness. That's why we continue to be conscious. To link this with the Lacanian metapsychology, here you can find the real of jouissance as a non-representational surplus excitation. In other words, it's the residual of what is not met, what is not explained, what is not satisfied by the cognitive work of the ego. And we can see the connection with signifiers, and I'll get into this in a little more detail, perhaps. But signifiers as, first and foremost, motoric traces. If you think about the word forest from the example, the signifier level of forest has nothing to do with the representation of either the brother or of the woods. It's the purely motor element of speech. Speech is first and foremost, language is first and foremost a motor phenomenon. That you pronounce the word forest, and it's on that motor articulatory pattern that is then connected to multiple references, multiple sort of manifest experiences, ideas, understandings. Forest, what does forest mean? It means, oh yeah, the wood thing. Oh, it also means the brother. So these varied meanings are hinged upon the signifier as specifically the motoric dimension of language, to which affective consciousness is linked. There's a certain, in the case, there's this certain, fear or conflict associated with the brother that was not fully resolved, but nevertheless, that affect is linked to the signifier forest and found manifest explanation in the image, or rather in the manifest experience of running through the forest, tripping over and having the feeling, oh, someone's following me. But the link is through the link to this unexplained affect, undealt with affect, the residual or surplus affect is via the motor trace of the signifier. Okay. I think that's probably been about an hour, which means I'm somehow magically on time. But perhaps, Peter, should we stop here? Maybe for a little questions and discussions of the Lacanian neuropsychoanalytic background before I go into talking about affects like signifiers.
Yeah, we could, for a few questions, perhaps not too many, but absolutely.
Okay, yeah, maybe if there's maybe a few questions about this, and I'm happy to jump around the slides as needed.
Do anyone have a question?
I have a question, if I may.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So thank you for your presentation. It's a really exciting theory, and I was just thinking about Lacan's work, and in the sense that he also speaks about. I mean, when he addresses the environment in some of his theories, he addresses the the object A, right? The object A, and I was just thinking, what are your thoughts of the environment and the role the environment might play in the ability to I don't know, kind of resolving, or maybe, I don't know, minimizing the impact of the real, or it's like I have some trouble verbalizing this question, but I don't know if you got something.
Yeah. Thank you. Let me just jump back here. Oh no, that's not sure. Give me 1 second. Okay, good, we're back. Okay, great. Yes. So the environment, and by environment, I'm hearing it both sort of even, yes, the immediate physical environment, but also especially, most importantly, social environment, history especially. There's a wonderful paper in the Neuropsychoanalysis Journal by Katerina Fotopoulou and Manos Sakaris. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but they argue that even the minimal levels of homeostasis, even like very sort of basic body regulation, is firstly embodied, and secondly develops through an intimate connection with the caregiver. So basically, this, sorry, let me just bring back the pointer. Come back. This stuff, yes, we're born with these circuits, but how to meet those circuits, even how to interpret or make sense of those circuits, even before you even try to meet them, all of that is indexed to the environment. All of that is indexed to the shared social world. As I said, the baby, so yes, the id maybe has these different circuits, but the ego doesn't know that. The ego has to learn to interpret these. The baby feels many of these things, cries. The mother has to interpret, oh, you're, alone. If the baby's crying in the other room, or the mother has to interpret, oh, the baby's hungry, or maybe the baby has to be changed. That all has to be interpreted, and that all of that interpretation shapes, but not only even at the verbal level, even and this is developed very nicely in that paper that I referenced, even at the level of early development, how the mother or primary caregiver, doesn't have to be the mother, interacts with the child, or multiple caregivers, how they physically interact with the child to sort of shape how the basic emotions are managed. And you can think about in sort of clinical stuff. Why do certain zones of the body acquire certain emotional significance or lack thereof? I'm forgetting which case, but I think this is developed or referenced in Daring Leader's book on jouissance. The caregiver, maybe, caringly strokes and comforts the infant, but the caregiver's hand stops at a certain point of the body. That demarcates a certain difference between one area of the body and maybe another area of the body that might be libidinally charged. All of the and this is the other points. There's an idea in some of the computational work of what's called I'll translate it, shared action or shared inferences. The idea that the term that is used to manage these things is not just something inside one person's brain. It's multiple people's brains making sense of the same unknown. So, for example, there's an example of a patient who has one important signifier or term in their history is bad boy. It's a signifier, and it's a representative for the subject. And you can imagine that comes with a certain kind of baggage that might link to it. However, the subject is not only a bad boy to himself, but that designates a certain relationship to the mother. The subject is also a bad boy for the mother, also a bad boy that when that signifier comes into contact with, in the speech of parents between, or with other people, oh, he's a bad boy. Maybe that gets a little sexual charge or something. The meaning can vary, but like that functioning as a representative, it's not inside one person's brain. It is shared in a network, in a social network, even at the level of non-declarative, deeply ingrained things. And the same idea applies with to broaden across all these things, sort of linguistic. It's not that it's impossible to think about the brain and its functions without the environment, without everything outside of the brain. The brain is constantly inferring what is outside of itself. And again, you have this kind of extimate structure where what is inside the brain is actually inferences of what's outside the brain. And you have this wonderful kind of loop that it's not a clear inside-outside boundary.
So I'll make a cut there. Maybe we could move on to part 3. I think it's a perfect moment for that part.
Yes, I think that's a good segue. Okay,
yeah,
let's continue.
So we could take more questions after the last part. So.
Okay. So now I'm going to briefly develop, this is some of my more current work, and this is elaborated in a paper that's currently under review. When it is published, I can share the link with Peter, and perhaps he could attach it to the YouTube because I develop in more detail there. Okay. So if you've heard anything about Lacan, you've probably heard he says this thing: the unconscious is structured like a language. He repeats it till his face is blue. What does that actually mean? What does he mean by that? And very often, and I'm not dismissing this at all, and especially, and it's in part an artifact of the psychoanalytic situation. What happens in psychotherapy? It's an exchange of speech, first and foremost. Before anything else, you're talking to another person. Before you make inferences of object relations and internal fantasy, yes, and that's all very important too. But first and foremost, you're exchanging words. The primary material of an analysis is words. And Lacan argues that you can actually get quite a bit of mileage out of really focusing on the words the patient uses. And the example I gave from Ariane Bazin, I think, illustrates that beautifully. That it's in the come to think about it, I live on Forest Street, running through the forest. My brother's name is Forest. It's at that level that you could hear something new. Sorry if someone could just mute their microphone. The idea here is that language, as I said, signifiers are first and foremost a differential system. In other words, the phoneme ba is different from the phoneme ma, is different from pa, is different from t. They sound different, and they're sort of differentiated, and it's the combinatorial, it's the association, the combination between these differential elements that generates everything else, basically. It generates meaning, generates ideas, content, and so on. But first and foremost, the structure is dependent on this differential system. One thing is not the other, it's defined in opposition to the other. As I've been developing and discussing these emotional systems, these affects are qualitatively distinct. For Solms, in his model of consciousness, if all of these affects were a single kind of feeling, if there were only a unitary positive negative feeling, there would be no means to differentiate these different homeostatic set points, and presumably the organism would die because they need to be felt differently to motivate the different things because they demand that you do different things. Sleep and hunger have to be felt different because if when you feel negative affect, you only sleep, then and because the feeling of sleepiness motivates sleep, then you won't eat. And vice versa, if when you haven't had enough sleep, and we know that sleep is very important, if you only eat and never sleep, then you will never satisfy the need to sleep. And likewise for all of these other affects. They have to be sort of met in their own right, each of these systems. And so what you get at the level of the feeling itself is already a minimal qualitative distinction. In other words, the emotions are already themselves differential. They're not defined in the sense of like a semantic definition, but they're felt in opposition to each other. The opposition drives different motor and cognitive cascades. Again, in that aversive situation, the feeling of fear drives a certain kind of response that is different from the response that follows rage, but that difference is already there at the level of the feeling in terms of what has been prioritized. Furthermore, no affect has a fixed referent. In other words, yes, there are innate things of what to do. And this is why I say it's structured like a language, not the same thing as affects are like signifiers, not the exact same thing. There are certain innate behavioral stereotypes for each of these systems, and I explain them, the clawing, the attack for rage, and, the separation, distress, vocalization for panic. However, not only because of the uncertain environment we live in, but because they conflict with each other, the subject, everyone, has to come up with new responses, has to essentially learn. And that's the essence of the ego. The ego has to do a ton of learning, and the ego is doomed to always be learning, has to learn different things to do to deal with these affects, especially affects in conditions of uncertainty and conflict. In other words, what is learned to be done in relation to the different systems is not innate. It is not fixed. In other words, it can also change potentially. And this is the essence of what happens in therapy. There is a conflict, and what actions follow from that conflict? What is referent is not the right word for this, but what is signified? Not even the meaning that follows that feeling, although yes, you interpret that and the meaning can change. But what follows from that is not innate, and again has to be learned, and yes, again is learned heavily indexed to the environment and the big other. How the mother interprets the child's crying will interpret what is prioritized by the child. It's unclear what to do. Furthermore, I have said that each of these systems has like a certain, like, it is good to blank, it is not good to not blank, or whatever. It's good to stay close to caregivers. The little child doesn't know that. When the little child is feeling separation distress, the child is thinking, oh, gee, it's really terrible that I'm not next to my mom right now, and that's probably not good for my survival and evolutionary reproductive success. I'm not likely to pass on my genes. No, the child isn't thinking that. The child is just feeling bad and calling out to the parent. Likewise, for when you're starving, you're not thinking, oh boy, my blood glucose is really dropping right now. You don't need to think that in order to feel hungry. The hyperparadigm, this is a term from computational neuroscience. It's another word for that homeostatic set point. That set point it's not known. It's not an innate idea. We have to research this. We had to research this to find out what they were. You're not thinking when someone's coming at you with a knife, oh boy, survival of my body integrity is important for me to pass on my genes. No, you're just feeling terrified and you run away, or you defend yourself, or what have you. The ideas that motivate these are not, they're quite simply not ideas. They're primarily repressed, if we want to put it in Freudian language. It's just the feeling. And again, as I've said, the structural conflict among the different emotions leaves some felt uncertainty inevitable. In other words, these emotions themselves, affective consciousness itself, already has the structure of a language. And again, for Lacan, the structure of a language is a purely differential system that has no clear stability. The meaning is forever not fixed. It's forever potential. That's where the freedom that comes with it is. There's ambiguity built into it, but nevertheless, it has a certain structure, and that structure follows from these differential elements. Affective consciousness, the infrastructure of the id, has the structure of a language. And this is what leads me to argue that affects operate like signifiers. And so what this leads to, we can then think of, okay, are there language-like operations that we can see in affects? Not separate from language, not separate from motor systems, all that stuff, but already thinking about it at the level of the feeling itself. And so here, I think Melanie Klein's work actually does a ton to illustrate this. She doesn't use this approach of basic emotions per se, or of Lacanian language stuff, but I think her theory illustrates this quite beautifully. So, for example, she writes, the hunger for objects so characteristic of mania indicates that the ego has retained a defense from the depressive position, introjection of good objects. And here's the important part. The manic subject denies the different form of anxiety associated with this introjection. Depressive anxiety, that's to say, that if you introject bad objects or destroy the good objects by this introjection of the bad objects, the denial relates not merely to the impulses of the id, but also the concern for the object's safety. Just taking a step back to simplify, what is happening? What is she describing here? She's describing a conflict, firstly, and that the mechanism of the denial and the manic defense is referring to an associative or a differentially or a contiguous organization of affects. First, there's a minimally felt depressive position anxiety. That's this, the anxiety associated with the destruction of the good object. Interjecting the bad object, putting it together with good object, concern for the object's safety. Yeah. How is it denied? It's denied by shifting from one affect to another affect. This depends on this affect being different from this affect. In other words, if we want to translate this into neuropsychoanalytic terms, there's a felt conflict between fear, rage, panic. At the very minimum, let's just say rage and panic. The loved object, the good object, the caregiving object, and the fear that some destructiveness will destroy that caregiving object. That's a conflict. And it's, one way to deal with that conflict is, in other words, to not feel these. That's what the denial is doing. That's what the manic defense is doing here. In terms of the neuropsychoanalytic perspective, the feeling that gets prioritized, again, remember, because they demand different results, only one system has to be selected, prioritized, while others are not selected, not prioritized. There's a displacement from these feelings onto this feeling in terms of where consciousness is displaced. It's not merely a displacement of affect. I'm fearful of my father, but because that conflicts with stuff, I displace my fear onto the horse, as in the case of little Hans. No, here there's a displacement at the level of what is even felt. There's a displacement in the prioritization function itself. From the anxiety, depressive anxiety from this conflict, I feel seeking. I shift my feeling from one affect to another. In other words, you feel one thing instead of another. To give another example, the same logic you could see in how Klein describes the dynamic, repetitive dynamic, again, of love, guilt, and reparation. There is some, again, destructive impulse toward the object of affection. This leads to guilt, which then motivates, because in fantasy, there's been some destruction of the object or some harm done to the object. This motivates what Klein calls the reparative impulse, the impulse to fix the wrong that has been done, to make good the harm that the subject has done, either in actuality or in fantasy. Again, if we want to translate this into neuropsychoanalytic basic emotional terms, there is, again, some conflict, rage, say, with care and lust. Again, destructive impulses that are conflicting with the object of the pleasurable object or the object of affection. These basic emotions conflict with each other. This leads to anxiety over the destruction or the loss of the object, the feeling of guilt. It's discussed how secondary emotions like guilt, shame, paranoia, and things like that come from the combination, in other words, condensation. Two differential things are smushed together. You condense two words together to create a new word. That's another linguistic-like operation that Lacan talks about. Extimate is his playing with them. You take two signifiers, smush them together, that's condensation, and then you generate a new signified. It's the combinatorial associative access of differential representations that when you put it together or separate it or displace along the chain in a certain way, you generate different representations, different meanings, different ideas. The same logic of condensation we see talked about with respect to emotions. When you combine these feelings together, you get guilt. And then what does that then lead to afterwards? Okay, there's some sort of confluence with, let's say, caregiving impulses that are directed toward the object via seeking. Okay, I feel guilt for what has been done, and I attempt to care for, make good, make some reparation toward the damaged object, to take care of it in a certain way. Again, you can see not only condensation of affects, but also displacement along a chain. There's a certain feeling, followed by a certain different feeling, followed by a different feeling. And these follow a certain order, a certain continuity. In other words, they have a certain association together, the same way that signifiers might be associated with each other in a certain chain. To give another example, What this leads to, and again, I think this talks about it quite nicely. It's less of a question of, okay, what's the underlying affect here? When we look at it like this, it becomes, from a Lacanian perspective, we think about, okay, or from like a purely orthodox Lacanian perspective, it's like, okay, what are the key signifiers here? How do these different signifiers associate with each other? What does, one signifier link to another? Again, on these sort of switch points like forest. From a Lacanian neuropsychoanalytic perspective, a similar logic can be applied to affects like signifiers. What is the particular constellation of affects? Not what is the key affect or what should the person be feeling or what is the affect they should be dealing with. No, it's how do we situate them relative to each other in this particular history of the patient. So here's an example from one of Klein's cases. If, for instance, a woman loses her child through death, along with sorrow and pain, her early dread of being robbed by a bad retaliating mother is reactivated and confirmed. Her own early aggressive fantasies of robbing her mother of babies gave rise to fears and feelings of being punished, which strengthened ambivalence and led to hatred and distrust of others. The reinforcing feelings of persecution in the state of mourning is all the more painful as a result of an increase in ambivalence and distrust. Friendly relations with people which might at that time be so helpful become impeded. I love Klein's clinical descriptions. In other words, to sort of reduce this, there is some affect, sorrow over the loss of a child, i.e. grief, that is associated with, reactivates another affect, dread of being robbed by the bad mother, my own fear and the other's rage, the sort of frustrating, threatening object. Along with another affect, my own early aggressive fantasies of retaliating against said bad mother. So we've got fear, rage, grief. And what does this lead to? This leads to ambivalence, hatred, and distrust of others. Ambivalence where my proactive impulses seeking out attachment figures, caring figures, conflicts with rage and fear. So this ambivalence, we have an entire constellation of these different affects: grief, fear, rage, seeking, panic. That it's not which one. It's not merely which one is prioritized. Although yes, maybe one or a condensed version of one is prioritized. It's okay. How do they operate differentially to each other? What is the relationship between the affects, analogous to what is the relationship between the signifiers? With the next step, what would it even mean to think clinically? Can we have an impact on this associative connection, on this network of the relationship between these signifiers? And clinical interpretation, I think, is brilliant here, where it's the repetition of an affect that brings with it a host of associated affects based on, again, the particular history of the subject, their own prior social experiences with their interpersonal environment. It's the repetition of an affect here that brings a whole host of other things that are perhaps unconscious or perhaps not manifestly felt or known or something like that. Let me just to move along. Let's just move along, and I can come back to that if it's needed. So this leads to sort of a general argument, and I take this argument from Adrian Johnston. He has based on Freud. Again, as I said, that affects are not unconscious the same way ideas are, that in the process of repression, the idea is rendered unconscious and the affect goes somewhere else, or perhaps it's transformed most often into anxiety. In this viewpoint, all affects are fundamentally misfelt, because if we begin from conflict among basic emotions, no matter which affect is prioritized, it means that we're not feeling something else, or we're neglecting something else. And it's already sort of a misfeeling. It's a feeling something else, a slip of the heart, if one can put it that way, feeling something else instead of another. this follows, this isn't necessarily new, just to be clear. One common interpretation of, if someone's feeling, afraid of something, it's like, oh, maybe you actually want to do that. Or, if you kind of feel kind of self-critical of, oh, gee, I'm not doing this, well, then the interpretation is, well, maybe you don't want to do it, when you maybe feel like you should be wanting to do it. You can feel one thing in place of another, or the feeling can be transformed. But that's that sort of differential selection, because in a slip, one signifier is selected over another signifier. That's the metaphoric function of selecting and substituting one signifier for another, one representation for another. The same thing can happen with emotions. You can feel one thing in place of another. Indeed, you have to. If there's a conflict, say, and this often happens between, do I have this example somewhere? Maybe I have it back here. If you have a condition of conflict between, in an abusive caregiving situation, say, there's a conflict at least between panic and fear, also rage and a whole host of other things. If you prioritize not fleeing, staying with the abusive figure by prioritizing panic, by selecting panic, you're feeling in a not necessarily straightforward way, and definitely in a conflictual way, but you're following that affect over fear. One system has been prioritized over another system. And then, again, can we think about this clinically? Is there a way to have an impact on this prioritization function? Analogous to, okay, what's the word that has been repressed here? What's the unspoken element that we would think about it from a Lacanian viewpoint? Okay, and just to hammer home this idea, if basic emotions are structured like a language, then this means there is no sort of proper original affect. Yes, you begin with affective consciousness, but it begins with a contradictory space. There is no sort of correct affect, and this is very much against a teleological model, which is sometimes argued, especially in sort of more kind of directive, this person, and more sort of top-down approaches, you should, do this, or, you should feel that. No, and this is the essence, of psychodynamic approaches that, well, no, why should you do what you are told the superego tells you to do or to feel? It's against sort of a teleology of what is proper. And likewise, this creates that fundamental rift of homeostasis. If all of these homeostatic set points, yes, they maybe have a certain teleology, but if they conflict with each other, then that innate evolutionary teleology is undone. Because if they conflict, then they're never fully satisfied in their own rights because of the conflict and the necessity of compromise formation. This linguistic structure of differentiality around this constitutive conflict or antagonism means that this innate homeostasis is undone. Again, there is no homeostasis of homeostasis. Very briefly, let me just say a couple of sort of clinical directions that I think this sort of suggests, at the very least. We can then think about how in sort of orthodox Lacanian approaches, and in common, not only Lacanian approaches, many approaches, modulation of affects, changing how people deal with affects or think about affects. This often happens and is thought about through symbolic declarative activity. Yeah. And you think about sort of dealing with, the play of signifiers, dealing with other potential meanings that a signifier might have. This is shown in the work from the example of Forrest. Dream interpretation, moving from the manifest meaning to the latent meaning. Scansion is the Lacanian term for the cut that Peter so kindly did for me. The sort of sudden ending of a session at a certain key point with an attempt to have an impact. This is the variable length session that may be shorter or longer than the predefined time. And the essence of this relies on addressing the signifier as a formal aspect rather than the manifest meaning. One famous Lacanian example from Lacan's own practice, this is from a documentary. One of Lacan's patients says how she had survived the Nazi occupation of France, and she has the symptom where she keeps waking up at 5 a.m. in a fright, and she's talking about this to Lacan, And she says that at 5 a.m. is when the Gestapo came to the houses. And it's in French, and in French it's pronounced Gestapo. And at that moment, Lacan, in his characteristically non-conventional fashion, jumps up from his chair and strokes the patient on the cheek. This one very provocative and surprising intervention plays, and this is how she interpreted it, Gestapo was transformed into Gestapo. And someone can please correct my French, but it's essentially sort of a touch on the cheek, or like a feeling, or a touch, a stroke on the cheek. And she says it didn't take away the pain, but it turned it into something else, and she can still feel that touch years later after the analysis. And and also the symptom alleviates a bit. And so it's a play on the linguistic structure that is betrayed in the speech about the symptom.
John,
However,
perhaps I make it's 15 minutes before the ending, so so you know.
Okay, 2 minutes, perhaps 3. Okay,
Absolute.
So very broadly speaking, this is found both within sort of Lacanian circles and also outside of generally. There's a limit to what can sort of be symbolically interpreted. Freud calls this, Lacan calls this the real of the symptom. Freud calls this the bedrock of castration in analysis, terminable, interminable. And Solms talks about there's always a risk of regression to our automatized ways of dealing with things. In other words, there's always some, as I've been saying, some residual affect or something that kind of resists perfect resolution. The idea of affects as structured like a language means that, okay, yes, there will always be some residual, some surplus, some excess jouissance, but perhaps how that feeling is prioritized, perhaps that can be changed. Yes, you may do the same thing again and again and again and again. Perhaps you're doomed to repeat that. The signifier is doomed to repeat, but perhaps the way that the way that jouissance is modulated relative to the symptom, there may be an impact. This opens a way for differently thinking, okay, what does one do with one's symptom? And just this is the last point to make. This also opens, I think, wonderful new ideas. If affects are structured like a language, can one apply Lacanian techniques that we think about in relation to words? Can you apply that in relation to feelings? And Klein already does that in her example. And if you read her case studies, she does this a lot. Repeated affects, the same way that you might listen for a repeated signifier, and I think we all often do this, but to think about it as linguistic, like you listen for the affect that repeats. Why is this affect repeating? The same way, there's the repetition of the signifier forest. Why is this certain panic repeating as opposed to another affect? Is there a way, what is it indexing? What constellation is it bringing with it that may be unfelt or misfelt or felt somewhere else? What would it mean to punctuate or scan or cut a feeling sequence? For example, and this comes from my own work with a patient, someone who describes how they'll be suffering from intense kind of like separation distress and insecurity in relationships, and talks about how it happens often in situations where maybe and this takes time for us to kind of get to this point, but talking about, oh yeah, they feel like a little angry, or there's something that's frustrating, or maybe something that's something else that's attractive, and then they sort of shift immediately onto feeling the separation anxiety. What would it mean to cut the chain from lust or rage that then displaces onto panic, onto separation? So what would it mean to cut the feeling sequence, as opposed to cutting the chain of signifiers that can generate a different meaning, to cut the feeling sequence that can generate a different predictive cascade that follows from feeling something else? What new that opens up? And we already do this. Like, okay, let's stay with that other feeling that you're not often used to staying with. But to already see that it's coming from the idea of affects structured like signifiers. I'll come back to that if we can, but let me stop there. Okay, perfect, at 2 o'clock. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you for a very interesting lecture. I have so many questions, but perhaps the attendees has some questions for John. Feel free to speak.
Hi, John. Lovely presentation, very generous from you. And one thing that I was thinking about is that when you are in part 2 and you're talking about this scheme with the basic emotions and all, you have like the conflict, the place of the conflict is the place of the repression and the superego. Like you put it all in one place, like all the conflict is the place of the superego and the conflicts with the society and the internal basic emotions. Is that correct?
Thank you. Yeah, I think one of the things that comes from putting all this stuff into dialogue with neuroscience, we can carve things with a lot more fine detail when we realize how many different emotion systems there are, but how many different memory systems there are. Mark talks about this, and Freud even talks about this as well. And Klein develops this too, where it's the superego has multiple origins. The superego, I forget if is Freud talks about it or does Lacan talk about it like this, but the superego as a pure culture of the death instinct. That the superego, in a certain way, is a representative of the id. It's a sublimation of the id's death drive, the self-destructiveness of the death drive that is sublimated into the structure of the superego. So the superego has its roots both in the basic affects as well as the sort of commands of the society, and that's where that sort of intersection happens, where you have the sadism of the superego. Well, sadism for what? Oh, you are not meeting XYZ standards. Or this sort of gap. Or if you flip it in the Lacanian version of, oh, you must enjoy, you must be happy, and if you're not happy, then that's your problem. You should. That intersection is entwined at multiple levels, from affect systems encoded in deep brainstem structures, in limbic memory systems, amygdala most especially, ventromedial prefrontal cortex, in addition to the more sort of higher order later acquisitions of the superego that come from society that are housed in other brain structures that, of course, all of it's densely interconnected and interacting and everything. But you can also see this, I didn't talk about brain injury cases, but you can see this breakdown in different brain injury cases as well, that different aspects of the superego can be damaged differentially, that follow this sort of more fine-grained. So in the schema, it's there would be different levels of repression. And part of the idea of affects like signifiers, and I developed this in a little bit in the book, but it's really not sufficient there either, I think. We need to think of different levels of the symbolic in the Lacanian sense, that there are different levels, that affects are differential, motor functions are differential. One motion is not the same as another motion, and that has its own ambiguity. Gestapo is it's an act. It's not. Yes, it's linguistically organized, but we're already approaching the body as already then different from other things. And okay, well, if I may just briefly ramble very, very quickly, just because I love it. There's a wonderful paper by Jacques Lacan, where it's a recording of a talk that he gave in America, where he's talking about Heinz Kohut. In the case, this is a Kohut. It's a case from his book, How Does Analysis Cure? And he talks about how Kohut describes a patient who has a dream. And he says that this is a fundamental dream, that it reveals something key to the subject. And in the dream, the patient sees his mother with her back turned to him. So the patient doesn't see the mother's face. And it sort of gives image to a deep anxiety that in Kohut's theory that of not being able to solicit the smile of the self object, of the not being unable to solicit the smile of the caregiver, this being like a fundamental anxiety. And then Miller talks about how the the image on the back of this book is a smiling Kohut. And the way he says it, it's clear that Kohut's smile is not a smile. It's clear that Kohut's smile is a signifier.
Mhm.
It's not a word. It's a smile, but it's operating like a signifier. It's operating in this differential sense. And so once we see that, we broaden so much of how we can think about these different levels of the symbolic and so on. So yeah, thank you. Yeah.
No, thank you very much.
Some other questions? Then perhaps I could take my question. I just start reflecting about the notion about desire, Lacan's take on desire, when he says the desire of the desire is the desire of the other. What's your take on this? Is it like this synchronic relationship between parent and child, or how do you the take on desire, perhaps, to make it simple?
And yeah, and as with all of Lacan's things, they're all polysemic. So it's desire is desire of the other. It's like, oh, I want to be what I think the other wants me to be, or I want what the other person wants. But it's also desire is desire of the other. I desire that the other be desiring. So that also has a lot of different layers to it. But I think minimally, actually to approach it from where do we even get to desire? And someone asked before about object A. Object A, again, simplified sort of the nothing, the sort of unnamed distortional part of our sort of perceptual fields. It's the gaze, it's the position that is not imaged, but that nevertheless kind of structures the perceptual field in its not being there. It's veiled. It's in broad terms, in neuroscientific terms, that's the residual of uncertainty or the residual excess in perception of different kinds. Object A as voice, it's the sort of surplus of speech, of the process of speech that's not fully caught up in the signifier. It's the surplus uncertainty, the surplus affect that is embedded still within the audio-verbal neurocognitive domain. And for Lacan, object A is the object of the drive as a persistent not it, that's not quite it, and that's what the drive keeps sort of turning around this uncertainty. And the object A is the cause of desire. And so the cause for me to keep going on desiring, and yes, it's sort of shaped by the other's desire in terms of what objects I look for, but even more than that, desire as metonymic, desire as constantly, desire is desire. Once you get what you want, then desire is extinguished. So desire is, Lacan calls it desire squared. It's desire to desire. You want to keep desiring, and so to keep desiring, you have to not get what you want in order to keep wanting. So that sort of loop depends on the sort of maintenance or ongoing metabolization of that uncertainty within declarative cognition. And so that's sort of the, and then with that comes, okay, what then are the key routes that I tend to take in my circuit of going about managing desire or manifesting my desire.
I saw some association to seeking that you was talking about and desire, but as two different things, perhaps, but interconnected in some way. Seeking and lust, perhaps.
I think all of them, and again, this is a nice way of thinking about the affect can be misfelt. Lacan says that because the essence of desire is to not be satisfied, because as I just said, to desire you have to not have what you want, hence you can desire it. Desire often appears as frustration, so it can also be rage, or it can also be, all of these other sorts of things too. But the again, and this is where desire would come up in the particularities of how these different affects conflict with each other, again, based on the particulars of the person's history. That elementary constellation is the means through which you sustain desire, by sort of confronting this conflict in that way. I see Anna has her hand up.
Yeah, Anna, please ask the question.
Thank you for this lecture, John. It's very interesting. I don't know much about Lacan, but I've studied with Solms and Panksepp, and I was thinking recently a lot about the drive play, and we read a book in our society, Neuropsychoanalytical Society. It's a book called The Function of Play in the Development of the Social Brain by Pellis and Pellis. I don't know if you read it. It's a very interesting, it tries to really understand play. Why do we play? Why do mammals play? A lot of animals and children and also adults. So the role of play, and I think that this is really the area where we need to understand more. What is the role of play, and how can we restore the function of play in our patients? Because I see a lot of failure of play in workplaces, for example, and I don't know what you would take the role of play in your Lacanian framework, so to speak. Do you have anything to say about what would Lacan say about the drive play?
Yeah, thank you, Anna. Yeah, I developed this in the last chapter of the book quite a bit, but the essence of the idea is that, well, what is play? It's a way of, and Mark talks about this especially. It's a way of as if exploring anything, but especially these other drives, and especially the conflicts between these drives. Tag, there's a little ooh, and they're coming at me, I'm running away, or when you're, it's like, oh, I'm gonna get you, so it's a little condensation with these other affects, but in a way that's not too threatening. And so I think that not only Lacanian intervention, but all intervention, it's an attempt to play. It's an attempt to, there's some uncertainty that is being met with in a certain way, or being attempted to be dealt with in a certain way that's not working. Hence, there's suffering in the symptom coming in. And it's an attempt to play with the symptom. It's an attempt to metabolize uncertainty in a different way. I mean, that wordplay, not even just the my own wordplay of using the word wordplay, but wordplay, it's a way of thinking, okay, let's think as if this word is meaning something else. It's a way of sort of exploring uncertainty in a way that can drive reconsolidation, can drive change, can drive modulation without it becoming too threatening, too real. And that's where the point of rupture is, and that's where it becomes sort of too much. And just to say, the way that Solms talks about the Oedipus complex in his revision, I think it's in Second Quarterly, it's a wonderful paper. But essentially, the Oedipus complex is resolved through play. That, okay, you're in the situation of conflict with your key human figures. You have to create some solution to dealing with this conflict. And rather than playing out the Oedipus conflict in reality, like poor old Oedipus, who, kills his father and marries and sleeps with his mother, you play it out in fantasy. and this is in childhood fantasies, and very importantly, the action plans that come with that are the consequence of how you work it out in your head in this as if space. In other words, you get sort of a fundamental solution or structure to what is my particular unique way of dealing with these different drives. This is the same way, for Lacan, what follows from the Oedipus complex is the installation of what he calls the fundamental fantasy. And the fundamental fantasy is, in essence, it's a cognitive, affective, emotional schema of, okay, how do I, broadly speaking, what's my mode of dealing with the drive in relation to the other person? An internalized template that is formed, if we take it from the Solmsian route, it's formed through play. And what does one attempt to do in a therapy? You attempt to have some impact on these prior templates that we have. And the way to manage that, the way to do it is through play. This is how it was first solved, and that is what is happening in a psychoanalytical treatments. That it's a coming back to these early conflicts, coming back to the key cornerstones and action plans that were laid down to deal with these conflicts. And it's like, okay, can we do something? Can something different come of this? Can something different be thought, done? But through play, I think. I'll have to read the book. I've heard of Ellis and Pellis and Pellis, but it's good to know that there's a book that they have.
Perhaps I do a cut here again. It's 15 past 20, if you say so, and I think I'll perhaps, if you have something more to say, John, before we end today. It was we could talk all night about this. It's so interesting. I hope we get the time to do another lecture in the future, perhaps. So interesting. Do you
Yes,
have?
no, I'd be happy to come back. And just again, I really want to thank you, Peter, for inviting me, and thank the entire sort of organizing committee of the Swedish Neuropsychoanalysis Association, not only for inviting me, but again, to have, really 2 hours to talk this out and to, be able to cover these details. I really appreciate it. And most of all, and, thank you to everyone who came. And I'm happy to answer questions by email if there's any follow-up that we can get to talk about. I'm happy to do that. So thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you all for a great evening. I'll send you the link to the YouTube video. Just have to it could take time to get it out, but
and then you can cut my signifiers to make me say something else.
Yeah. Yeah. But thank you all today. See you sometime. Bye.